Okay, let's see. So, real quick, I've got a lesson planned. Not a lesson. I've got lessons planned on hell, and those are going to be done, I believe, the first week in December. In Bible class, we're going to go, and it's quite a bit. But I've been mapping it out and thinking about it a lot for the past couple of weeks, and I've decided to do that in a series of lessons because there's a lot we've got to talk about. And one of the first lessons we're going to give is something we're going to work up to over the next few weeks, and that is questioning God. Questioning God, okay? Because sometimes when we get into talk about hypothetical situations, or when we start talking about things that are a little bit difficult, a default answer that we go to is, well, his ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. And we use that as a way, I think, at least the way I've used it, to dismiss difficult questions or excuse ourselves, from having to try to find the answer to those questions in God's Word. All right? Now I believe that God has provided us with all things that pertain to life and godliness, and those answers, or that we can find answers to those questions if given enough, time in them. But we're going to talk about that over the next few weeks. Not today, but just getting that discussion generated about dealing with the quote, unquote, unknown and asking questions about the mind of God. And if you really want a classic textbook case on asking questions to God or asking questions about God, one great book that you could study is the book of Job, because that's all that book is. And so we're going to be getting into that a little bit. Now, one of the things, I wrote this down, and I want to pull it up real quick, just so I remember what I said exactly. Now, whenever we start talking about hell and who's in hell versus who's not in hell, or what hell is, sometimes we say, we'll just leave it up to God. Okay, well, if we're going to leave it up to God, then why are we going to have the lessons on hell anyways? Why even talk about it one way or the other? Okay, so if we want to do a lesson on hell, we can't just say, I'll just leave it up to God, because that means we shouldn't even be doing a lesson on hell to start with. So we've got to talk about this over the next few weeks, and about asking questions of God and asking questions about the nature of God, because sometimes people revert, and say, well, you shouldn't be talking about hypotheticals. And I don't think that's true, and I'm getting into my lesson for next week. But one of the reasons because of that is because of the parables. In the parables, Jesus offers explanation for only a couple of the parables out of all of them. He only offers explanation just for a couple of them. And in these parables, it's super outlandish thing. A man forgiving 10,000 talents of gold, that's a crazy amount of money. That would never happen in the real world. And so Jesus dealt in hypothetical situations all the time to make drastic comments on the nature of God that circumvented what many of the people had presupposed about God. And so when we start talking about stories and situations that seem outlandish, we're simply following in the footsteps of Jesus and talking about those same stories to bring about conclusions about God that we might not have had before. So we'll look at that next week, but start thinking about those things. Maybe read through some of the parables and some of the outlandish claims that the parable talks about, or maybe read through the book of Job and look at the questions that Job wasn't afraid to ask, and what his friends asked, and you'll start to see the philosophy that we need to adopt when addressing a subject as hell. It's not a comfortable subject by any means. It's not one that we can have, all the answers to where we are right now, because we can always grow and learn and progress. But it is a question that is extremely important because it changes how we view God, and so we need to address these things. So I'm just kind of mentally preparing for that for next week. But this week we're going to talk about a subject that's not contradictory. It's not contradictory, but it's not controversial at all, and that is giving on the first day of the week. But in order to do that, what we're going to have to do is get into some historical information about this subject and the Old Testament, and that's tithing. Okay? So, tithing, giving on the first day of the week. If you... Who knows where tithing comes from? Now, a tithe means to give a tenth of your income to God. But it wasn't just, in the Old Testament, it wasn't just money. It was agricultural products as well. Okay? And we're going to see in this morning's lesson that the function of tithing wasn't just, wasn't just to pay a preacher or something, but the function of tithing in the Old Testament specifically was to support the priesthood in everything. Since the priesthood had no land, had no anything like that, their job was to offer up sacrifices, and things like that. And so tithing was really to support them in every possible aspect of their life. And so that's why they gave things other than money. They gave things of the crops and all that sort of stuff too. But who knows where tithing comes from in the Old Testament? Because it predates the law.
Abraham gave tithe to Melchizedek after he took the lot stuff and back.
That's right. So Jacob is an early source, but it's not the earliest source. Go to Genesis chapter 14 and verse 18. He says, "And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and now he was priest of God Most High. He blessed him and said, Blessed be Abraham of God Most High, possessor," almost said professor. I was wondering, as I almost said that, I was thinking, professor? What does that mean? Well, the Bible says it, so I guess I better read it. Then I realized it said possessor. Possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. He gave him a tenth of all. So Melchizedek approaches Abraham. He blesses him, and then he gives him a tenth of his possessions. Now again, a tenth of all there, just, yes. Keith?
That's, Abraham gave a tenth, but that's not where tithe starts.
Okay, where does tithe start?
Tithe starts with Jacob. Jacob making a reference to when he was in this land and he fell asleep and made the stones to his hand, and he saw the ladder coming down.
Okay.
And he said if God would bless him, that he would come into his land and with all this thing, that he would give a tenth. He would give a tenth of what he has to God. And that from that point forward, tithing it was passed on from Jacob to his descendants all the way down. Abraham gave a tenth. It didn't say, did it say a tenth?
It is.
He gave a tenth to the high priest, but it was never set in order from that point that his descendants would do the same.
Okay. Well, that's just the first mention of it that we have
Abraham
in.
gave a tenth.
Okay.
It wasn't that he commanded it from that point from his descendants to do it.
Right.
But you see from Jacob, when Jacob made that promise of God was to bring him back into this land and safely, and that he would give a tenth, that was established from Jacob all the way down through his descendants.
Right, but this is the first example we have in the Bible of them giving a tenth of their possessions.
I'm just saying that wasn't where tithing comes from.
He said it began with Jacob, but then Abraham was before Jacob.
Yes, he was.
Right.
Is it more so that it was like the first example, but then
Abraham was the first one to start.
Yeah.
Right. And I would say that Jacob learned that from before probably.
Right.
Okay.
Well, at
You
the
can say that, but you don't have an example of that.
well, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter who started who started the tradition. The first example that we have in the Old Testament of somebody giving a tenth of their possessions, is Abraham to Melchizedek, and whether or not he started it doesn't really matter as much as he was the first one that did it that we have record of. Now there could have been others that did that before him. He could have got that from somewhere else. Who knows, but this is the first example that we have it in the Old Testament, and undoubtedly when people appealed to the reason for giving a tenth, I mean this one, this would have been the first example they would have came to just from reading their Old Testament. But as Keith pointed out, Jacob is the Jacob is also someone in the book of Genesis who gave a tenth. And if you look there, beginning in verse 12, Jacob has a dream. And behold, a ladder was set on the earth with its top reaching to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac, the land on which you lie. I'll give it to you and to your descendants. Your descendants will also be like the dust of the earth, and you'll spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and in your descendants shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I've done what I've promised you. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. He was afraid and said, How awesome is this place! There is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So Jacob rose early in the morning, took the stone, put it under his head, and set it up as took the stone that he put under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on its top. He called the name of that place Bethel. However, previously the name of the city had been Luz, and Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me and will take me on this journey that I will take, and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, and I will return to my father's house in safety, then the Lord will be my God, and the stone which I've set up as a pillar will be God's house, and all of that you give me, I will surely give a tenth to you. So there's the other example of in the patriarchal age of someone giving a tenth of their possessions to God.
This is very important that we all need to look at, because that place that he set the stone up, he said that would be that is the house of God.
Right.
And through history, I think if I'm remembering right, this is a place where the temple was established, and Jerusalem was built somewhere around that. Not only that, Jacob, as his name being changed to Israel, it was also something like passed down to his generation, which would incorporate the 12 sons of Israel.
Right.
So this was a command, or it was, I would say Jacob commanded of his descendants, and this is where you get Israel tithing and giving a tenth.
Right. I don't know about the geography of it at all. I know that
It's interesting if you look at it, because I think I did a study on it one time before, and it's been a long time. But you see where the temple was built there, and that it was a holy place, and it was a couple of temples built there. And Jerusalem was around Jerusalem as well.
Well, I know that there is speculation that, for example, the mountain that Abraham offered up Isaac on was the same mountain that, the same hill upon which Jesus was crucified and things like that. And there's a lot of, thoughts concerning that. For example, Amos chapter 4 and verse 4, Enter Bethel and transgress, and Gilgal multiply transgression. Bring your sacrifices every morning, your tithes every 3 days. And so there does seem to be a connection with Bethel and tithing that extended past Jacob. But I'm not sure about what you mentioned, the actual geographical location and all that sort of thing. All right, so we have tithing existing in the patriarchal age. We also have tithing, of course, most prevalent under the law. Numbers chapter 18, I believe it is, and then verse 20 says this. Numbers chapter 18, verse 20. Then the Lord said to Aaron, You shall have no inheritance in the land. This is getting back to what I mentioned at the beginning of the class. Nor own any portion among them. I am your portion and your inheritance among the sons of Israel. To the sons of Levi, behold, I have given all the tithe in Israel for an inheritance, in return for their service which they perform, the service of the tent of meeting. The sons of Israel shall not come near the tent of meeting, or they will bear sin and die. Only the Levites shall perform the service of the tent of meeting, and they shall bear their iniquity. It shall be a perpetual statute throughout your generations, and among the sons of Israel they shall have no inheritance. For the tithe of the sons of Israel, which they offer as an offering to the Lord, I have given to the Levites for an inheritance. Therefore I have said concerning them, they shall have no inheritance among the sons of Israel. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Moreover, you shall speak to the Levites and say to them, in verse 26, when you shall take from the sons of Israel the tithe which I have given you from them for your inheritance, then you shall present an offering from it to the Lord, a tithe of the tithe. Your offering shall be reckoned to you as the grain from the threshing floor, or the full produce from the wine vat. So you shall also present an offering to the Lord from your tithes, which you receive from the sons of Israel, and from it you shall give the Lord's offering to Aaron the priest. Out of all your gifts you shall present every offering due to the Lord, from all the best of them, the sacred part from them. You shall say to them, when you've offered from the best of it, then the rest shall be reckoned to the Levites as the product of the threshing floor and the product of the wine vat. You may eat it anywhere, you and your households, for it is your compensation in return for your service in the tent of meeting. You will bear no sin by reason of it when you have offered the best of it, but you shall not profane the sacred gifts of the sons of Israel, or you will die. So this brief text here in Leviticus chapter 18 just outlines the importance of the tithe in early Israel, and it was a means by which they would support the priesthood. And notice, though, it's an exact specification. You got to give a tithe. You got to give a tenth. Have you heard the argument? And I used this one time. Not just one time, but for quite a bit. And then someone pointed out to me the context of the passage, and I just sort of laughed at myself for using it in this way. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 20, Jesus says, For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Have you heard somebody say, see there? Your righteousness has to surpass that of the scribes and Pharisees. They did 10%, which means you need to do at least like 11, or more than 10%. Have you heard that before? Johnny?
I use that, and I'll continue to use that.
You continue to use it?
Ask me why.
Why?
I'm glad you asked that. Because, we go to scripture, we go to passages of scripture. A lot of times we take, even when ministers, you pick out a sermon.
Sure.
They will use certain passages of scripture. They won't use part of it without taking the whole thing.
Right.
This time when I use that and I make mention of it, they accept it, righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees.
Sure.
You have to go back and see what that pertains to. Yes, their righteousness. Righteousness is righteousness.
Right.
That's why I look at it. Righteousness is righteousness.
Right. And so, if they gave 10%, now, here's the thing, and I think I already know the answer to this, but do you think it would be wrong for someone to give less than 10%?
That's the question you're asking.
Oh, yeah, or you, since you're the one that said it, but do you think it would be wrong for someone to give less than 10% of their whatever possessions or income or whatever?
I think each individual has to examine themselves.
Good.
But at the same time, I think that we should give accordingly as God blessed us with.
Yes.
We said that we look at the light company, they bless us with electricity all week. Hey, we don't have a problem giving them that part. No
Right.
question,
Right.
But every day God bless us with life, health, rent, food, shelter,
Sure.
We don't think about, hey, we owe him that.
Right. So that's a rule that you set for yourself, but it's not necessarily how everybody, it's not a demand that everybody gives a specific set amount, above 10% or whatever, 10% or whatever. And that's really the point I'm trying to get at. Because we'll get into this a little bit later once we get into that passage. But I was just curious what your thoughts were on that. Keith?
I would say that when you read that scripture, we all understand it's not talking about just what you make as far as money is concerned. Your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees and the scribes. Well, what was their righteousness? A lot of people go to their righteousness was that of the law, but being faithful to that of the law.
Right.
And except you exceed that, some people would say that, being Christians and going and being under a better law exceeds that. If you are faithful to the principles of the teachings of Jesus. But also, I understand where John is coming from. God does bless us with life, health, and strength. He keeps us clothed in our right minds and keeps us healthy, and we're able to go on jobs and we're able to obtain money a tenth, is it really that much? Is it that all impending on us that we can't give a tenth or give a reasonable amount back so that his work may continue and he may continue to help others?
Sure.
So, when we ask that question, sure, I think that a reasonable person would realize what God does for him every day of his life, and when he has opportunity, that he would do the very best he could towards God. So when people try to short that, I think it's because they don't really want to give as they should in the first place. But all through the scripture, it teaches, God is teaching his people how to give
Right.
back. You can never outgive God, but he teaches us that principle that we are to give of our physical means in order to help others and also to help ourselves. Teach us the principles and the teaching behind giving and keeping us rooted and grounded and being able to understand that we don't live in this world to ourselves,
Right.
but to each other. So we have an obligation to help one another, and in this world we have to have money, we have to have finances to do any good work. And so, I can understand where Johnny coming from, but I don't think that's totally what the scripture it should be based on.
Well,
But it's something to be pointed out.
Well, I think another scripture that we could talk about, and Johnny, I'll let you answer in a second, is that, to whom much is given, much is required. There's a sense in which someone who makes minimum wage, who can, if they can even afford the rent, barely, if that, giving 10% would absolutely, destroy their ability to function in the society, And so what I'm talking about this morning and what we're going to get to is moving from thinking of giving as a legal requirement to an act of love and grace, in response towards God. We'll get into that in here in a little bit. Johnny?
And what Keith was saying also.
And then Robert.
When required children of Israel under the law, God required a tenth.
Right.
That tenth didn't come from the bottom. That whatever came in, the first belongs to God. That 10% came out, they got to God.
Right.
Whatever your plans are, whatever your intentions are, whatever, it came, and it depends on that you had left.
Right.
So many times today, we base our giving on what we have left. We left God complete out of the picture until, whatever I got left, I'm gonna pay my cell phone bill, I'm gonna pay the internet, I'm gonna pay the TV, I'm gonna pay the lights, I'm gonna pay my house payment, I'm gonna pay for these 3 cars I got. Now I got $20 left. Hey, I can give them 2 of those.
Sure.
And that's what we base it on, because we
Right.
begin to teach. And when I first became a member of the Church of Christ, one of the things that sort of like I looked at, because it used to be the older preachers. Now, the church don't ask for contribution. No, we don't operate from the contribution. God told us to go out and preach, so we go out and preach. So it got in a place where nobody really want to give. And then when it got in a place where the preachers, the later preachers, hey, no, you're supposed to pay the preachers. A lot of people frown on it and kicked on it, and we paying them that much, or whatever. The tithe that God told the children of Israel to give to the priests, because they didn't have any income. They were basing their living and taking care of the temple, everything out of what God was supplying them with.
Right.
And now they get to the place to where we teach, or we said, no, I don't think God intends for you to do that. If you ain't got it to give, you don't worry about it. We got car payment to be made. No, you don't worry about God. We'll make the car payment. I think that gonna be a downfall for some.
Sure.
Gonna get to a place where the church can't function, because the purpose of the church was to be able to take care of different things. The church, the work of the church, and like when Paul was writing, I'll do that later. I think Ken had his hand up.
He did.
I just had 2 thoughts about the conversation that centered around tithes and offering, because sometimes we just stop at tithes.
Right.
I was talking about tithes and offering. It goes back
talk about that in a second, about the widow with her 2 mites, because that's a very good example that we need to touch on. Now, you brought up someone with a car payment, 2 or 3 cars, big house payment, something like that. If someone is making those types of commitments, then absolutely, using that as an excuse to not give anything at all or whatever, or the remainder or the leftover or whatever, is not acceptable. But that's not the person that I'm going to be talking about here in a second. We're talking about somebody like the widow with her 2 mites. I'll get into that in a moment. But there's a difference between somebody that should be the object of our offering versus the people who should be the ones doing the offering, because there's some people like in our day, minimum wage worker today isn't like the minimum wage worker 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, or not 10, but 20, 30, 40 years ago, who could, that was a decent, you could get by a lot better then. Money went further than it does now, because the amount of pay that people receive hasn't been to scale with the rise in the cost of living. And so I'm not talking about somebody who has a car payment or who has a cell phone bill or something like that. I'm talking about the widow with the 2 mites. Now, we'll get to the widow with the 2 mites. Actually, let's just go do that now. Let's go to Mark chapter 13. Let's take a look at her, because this is something I think a lot of people don't catch. Look at Mark chapter 12 first, in verse 41 through 44. Mark chapter 12, verses 41 through 44. Okay. He sat down the opposite the treasury and began observing how the people were putting money into the treasury, and many rich people were putting in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, or 2 mites, which amount to a cent. Calling his disciples to him, he said to them, "Truly I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all the contributors to the treasury, for they all put in out of their surplus, but she out of her poverty put in all she owned, all she had to live on." Now, there's a couple ways to look at this story here in verses 41 through 44. We could be proud of this widow, good job, widow, you put in all that you own. But what is this really talking about here in verses 41 through 44? Is this not a critique of all these rich people who are giving out of the surplus? And here there's this widow that feels like she has to give all that she owed, and they're not helping her at all. I think this is more of a critique of the rich people putting in surplus instead of helping out this widow. And you look in the next chapter, what's the very next thing that Jesus says? You see all these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another which will not be torn down. So she has been convinced to give to this temple that's about to be destroyed. God doesn't live in a house made with human hands. She's putting in the contribution to the treasury, far more than 10%. And all these other people are putting out of their surplus. They're not even affected by it. That's like, Jeff Bezos tipping $100 versus us tipping $100. Yeah, it might be a little bit different there. I think this stands as more of a critique of this stands as more of a critique of the rich for not helping her out than it does to encourage the poorest members of the congregation to give in all they have and jeopardize meals on the table for their family in doing so. What do you think about that, Keith?
I don't think you condemning the rich. They gave out of their surplus of what they had. Could they have given more, possibly? Or could they have given exactly what they should have been given? Sure. I think this whole thing is looking at the widow and what she gave, because it wasn't commanded to her of her to give all that she had.
Right.
But out of a desire, this is how I look at it, out of desire to please God, put God first in her life, she made the choice to give all that she had. And when an individual does that, that is a personal choice that a person makes. It's
right.
Not out of command. The command is give a tenth, but if you don't have a tenth to give, then you don't give a tenth. But if you have just a little to live on, and you make a personal desire because you understand or you have a desire to serve God and make that sacrifice, you give, that is to be commended, because that person is showing a real dedication to the work of God.
Undoubtedly, her.
So I don't think it's so much putting any emphasis, because he looks at it and he says, you know, the rich give these great psalms, and he looks at that and he doesn't condemn that. He doesn't say that's good or yes, that's bad. He doesn't look at that, but he draws the comparison to this widow who gave everything that she had. Although it's a small amount,
Right.
she gave everything she had.
She did.
And why was that motivated? Why did she do that? She was motivated out of a desire and a sense of love towards God and the temple, and wanted to do her part to make sure that God's work goes on.
Right now, let's take a step back and let's think about the situation. Why did she give that money? Now, good on her, because she felt that what she was doing is what would be most pleasing to God. And undoubtedly, God blessed her offering and her action. That's not under consideration. But why did she do that? The reason why she gave that money into the treasury is for the same reason that these people in John chapter 2 could get away for so long with charging such outrageous prices for the offerings. See, why did they make such good money doing those offerings? Because they're telling the people, if you don't make an offering, if you don't make a sacrifice, you're not going to get the forgiveness of sins. Well, I guess I better make a sacrifice. Well, how much is it? Oh, it's like crazy amount of money. See, so Jesus condemns them for doing that in John chapter 2, and he flips over their tables and he drives them out. Why? Because they were taking advantage of people's faith in order to get more and more and more out of them. Now, you look all throughout the Old Testament, all throughout the prophets, one of the major things that Israel's condemned for over and over again is forgetting the fatherless and the widows and their affliction. James chapter 1 and verse 27 says, "Pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this, to visit the orphans and the widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world." This wasn't a new thing. This is something that had been true since the beginning. All throughout the law, this is emphasized. And so when I read this in Matthew 12, and I immediately read after that this temple that she's just put everything that she owns into supporting is about to be torn down within that generation, this is a critique of people taking advantage of her faith, of the religious leaders taking advantage of her faith, which led her to contribute those 2 mites. Good on her totally for doing that, But it's a critique of them and those wealthy people with so much to give and surplus to give that let her just go by. Why were they? Why did they let her? Why did they let her do that? Why didn't they give her out of their surplus instead of contributing to this? Instead of contributing to the temple, this isn't just part of a tithe that was required. This is giving out of surplus. This is extra. They weren't given it. They probably weren't even given a tenth to begin with. It's bad on them. They shouldn't have put a dime into that temple treasury without first giving to that widow. That's what I think. I think shame on those rich people there.
I agree with you. They should administer to the poor, but that's not what's being discussed here. It's that they were at a point where the treasury was there. This is the reason Jesus set out aside to watch what people was doing and what people was putting in the treasury, and where was it coming from. It's easy to give out of our surplus. When we got $100, it's easy to give $10. But it's not easy when you got 2 pennies to take those 2 pennies and put them in that pot. That's all you have. You don't have anything else. That's all to give everything. One was giving out of what they had.
Right.
One was giving everything they had. That was different.
And
that was the difference in the attitudes towards them. That's why Jesus said she's giving more, because she's given everything that she had.
And she was giving everything she had to a temple that was about to fall.
Yeah, we as we read on,
right,
we see that Jesus made that statement.
Right.
And that was when the apostles talked to him out up on the hill. They separated themselves away from that scene, and the apostles came to him and he made that statement to them.
So let's say someone comes here and they're homeless and all they have is $2. Should they put those $2 into the collection
If that's
plate?
their desire, that's their desire.
Okay.
I don't think anyone
We shouldn't let them do it.
I don't think anyone
It's not your
here
place.
thinks that that is appropriate to make a demand of anyone.
Right.
To give any set amount. So I mean, I get your thought process and I know people think like that, but
Right.
I don't think this audience in particular.
I know, I'm just-
is
people-
of that thought process. So, but what I'm saying is, if I make $1,000 a week and somebody else makes $50 a week, whatever I purpose in my heart to give, God knows my heart. God knows if I'm doing my best or if I'm throwing him my leftovers or whatever. it is.
Right.
I think it comes down to intent a lot of times. If I'm mismanaging my money, if I'm buying expensive cars, I'm just, overextending myself, obtaining stuff that I don't need, and I'm just, not doing what I should be doing, and then
Right.
I'm gonna give him whatever penny. Absolutely, that's inappropriate. If a person is poor or almost on the brink of being homeless, I don't think anybody in here expect them to come in here and put everything they got in a collection plate. That would make
Sure.
no sense.
Well, yes, yeah, I've heard so many people use this passage to demand that the poorest of the poor, follow suit in this widow. Now, here's the thing. Again, this widow should have never had 2 mites left to begin with.
Right.
That she shouldn't have had 2 mites left because all these people with the surplus, again, it's surplus. She should never have been in a situation where she had to give 2 mites. She should have had way much more than this in her life. This is the problem. And this is why that temple had to come down in what Jesus talks about in the next passage. People were focusing on the wrong things. People were saying it's all about the temple when this human being that God loves is here. And God doesn't dwell in houses made with hands. And here's this human being that God loves that has to put in all she has. That's all she has left. I think that the situation portrayed here in Mark chapter 12, 41 through 44 is, it's saying that this widow should have never had 2 mites left to begin with. And I think that if someone came into our assembly that was honest and that loved God and was down on their luck and was trying to get a job but couldn't, or had a job and it didn't pay anything worth, to get them by in this life, then before they ever think about putting something to the collection plate, we should have already taken care of them out of our surplus. That's, I think, the point that needs to be made. And this is what the New Testament Christians did. Go to Acts chapter 2. You can go to Acts 3 and go up a little bit, but go to the very, very end of Acts chapter 2. And notice what happens here among the saints. He says in Acts chapter 2 and verse 42, they were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone kept feeling a sense of awe, and many wonders and signs were taking place to the apostles. And all those who believed were together, had all things in common, and they began selling their property and possessions and were sharing them with all as anyone might have need. There wouldn't have been a situation among the first century church where a person had 2 mites, because they would have been taken care of sufficiently by those that had and by those that were willing to give.
Yet there was an incident in which in the New Testament church around that time. That's the reason that they had to come together and put their hands on these 11 to take care of the work.
That's right.
Because certain parts of those same Christians were being ignored and not administered to.
That's right.
So,
in Acts chapter 6 and verse 1.
So it did happen.
It did happen.
It was something that took place.
And that's
And certainly, any of us that know a sister or brother that doesn't have the necessities of life and need assistance, I wouldn't say bare necessities of life, that are hurting and need help, it is our responsibility when we have to share that we have with them. And that's just basic. And why the world is the way it is, or why the United States is where it is, because we have that type of selfishness that we walk past people that we know need help and we won't administer to them. So yeah, they end up giving their last when they're moved to do so. and they want to contribute, they end up giving their very
Right.
last of what they have. And I think God looks at that, the intent of a person's heart, what his desire or her desire is, and what their means are as to whether or not he has that really respect towards that individual.
Right.
It's like I say, it's easy when you have a lot to give a little.
Right.
But when you don't have any at all, and you still or very little, and you still have that desire, and you make that effort and that sacrifice to do it, I think God take note to that, and he recognizes that.
I think so too. I just think that well, we're going to look at this in the New Testament because we haven't really got to Paul's letters yet. We might have to do this tonight or so. We can just postpone tonight's lesson for another week. Is fine. But what we need to really get into the discussion of later on this evening is giving. We need to talk about is giving a legal requirement for all Christians in the New Testament. And we'll look at that tonight, and we'll have to look at some passages about that. But Johnny.
This is tonight. But anyway, the whole conversation we're speaking about giving and looking at giving, it's all like bringing to mind that
Right.
Malachi, or
Where they robbed him of his tithes.
right, something like chapter 3.
Yeah.
Sure.
Because a man robbed God.
Right.
How is it we rob God? In your tithe and your offering, you rob him by he didn't say cars and cell phone. He didn't say that.
Sure.
I'm saying that. We
Right.
rob him because we can go and buy our cell phone.
Yes.
And all these other gadgets and different stuff to give. And
Sure.
we give God the leftover. What these people were doing, if they had a cow that was sick, they swapped that good cow for that bad cow and give it to God.
Sure.
Give God the leftovers, and that's
Right.
exactly what we're doing when we give it. If we take and go and buy whatever we want, and then, hey, this turn my purse upside down, that's all I got, I'm giving it.
Sure.
You know, but you done robbed them, you done took
Yeah.
everything else from them.
No, I agree with that.
Widow, and that widow, I looked at that widow, she gave what she had because she felt like God had given her more than that. And when they put that money in the temple, was that money was supposed to be for the Levites? The working of the temple?
Well, it's hard
the running of it?
to tell because it says that they didn't give a tenth. It says they gave out of their surplus, which wouldn't be a tenth.
Rich man,
You know.
rich man gave out of his riches whatever he had, but the widow might gave all that she had.
Right.
And like Keith was saying, hey, maybe that was a tenth of what that he had, even though he gave more. And one passage of scripture I kept looking for, and I couldn't ever find it. And I was trying to get exactly pen like that or written like that, so I took it that way. It said the one that had more gave more, the one that had less gave less, but they all gave the same. Why? Because each one of them gave 10% of it. If you got 10% of sheep and cows and pigs and hogs, you gave 10, 20, 30, 40%. But if you count it all up, that's still not the 30. That's still not the 10%. That's still not the 10% of it.
Right.
So if the person got just one set of cows or whatever, he just gave a tenth of that. He didn't give that much, but he gave a tenth. He gave the same thing this other guy gave, a 10%. A tenth.
Right. Well, we'll get into some of this as well tonight. We'll especially want to look at 1 Corinthians 16 and 1 and 2, and a couple of other passages from 2 Corinthians. I think it's 2 Corinthians 9. Ashley?
And whenever we do look at this, I do want to know, like, what for modern day. I mean, it's great to look at how it started, where it ended up, but what are we doing now? Like, what should we be doing? And also the thought process behind how we go about helping. Because I'm gonna be real honest with you, working in what I work in and dealing with the things that I see daily. Sometimes what presents as I'm down on my luck, I have nothing, is a hustle.
Right.
I'm just gonna be honest about it.
Yeah.
I don't even know how else to say it. And I don't mind helping anybody, I don't. But when I know, it's one thing to think or speculate, but when you know a person is not doing what they're supposed to be doing or using their money for drugs or whatever else they're doing, and
Right. Well, that's a definitely touchy subject, and it's hard to, to judge the situation. There's a Second Thessalonians chapter 3. We quoted a lot. If a man doesn't work, neither shall he eat. But the idea of doesn't there is not willing to work.
Right.
Right. And so there's a difference between not working and not willing to work. Somebody could have lost their job. Somebody could be working. This is a big problem in our country. Somebody could be working two or three, some single mothers work 2 or 3 jobs and still don't have enough to,
Right.
to get by on.
But see, like when I say that, I'm talking about the not willing.
Right.
The
So
not
that's,
even trying.
I think that should be our criteria by which we judge that situation. But okay, what we're going to do tonight is we're going to look at giving in Paul's letters, and what we're going to try to do is talk about giving as a chore or giving as a requirement versus giving out of love, as Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians chapter 9. Because, well, there's just, we'll get it. If I start now, I'll just keep going. So I'm going to go ahead and just stop. So we get into that tonight. Let me just go ahead and say that. Because I do think there's a difference. Same with like attendance on Sundays, because